This is a talk through the content of the chapter on the role of time in linguistic and social variation, in case it helps. So we are going to cover these main concepts: noticing and measuring language change, apparent time hypothesis, real-time studies, age as a social factor. Obviously, we don't all talk the same, and we don't change our language overnight. If there is change, it's always gradual. Maybe we're both using old and new forms together for a while. Maybe some of us use old forms, some of us use new forms, and change over time is reflected in variation at any single time point. Not all variation is part of change, though. Some variation is stable, and competing language forms coexist in a language society, and the percentage of those different forms is stable over time. So some of them stick around for centuries. So which variation is stable? For example, here are some options. Try to guess which ones are stable and which ones are in progress. G dropping, like jumping versus jumping. Quotatives. I'm like, wow, versus I said, wow. Negative concord, you don't know nothing versus you don't know anything. And intensifiers. That's so stupid versus that's very stupid. Okay, now let's check which ones are stable and which ones are in progress. G dropping is stable. It has been, those forms have been coexisting for a long time. Quotatives are changing. This is a recent invention. Young people, similar to you, are using like when they mean say or said. Negative concord is stable. It has survived. Both competing forms have survived for a long time. Intensifiers are changing. Right now we're replacing very with so. So this change is in progress. How do we know? Well, we compare the speech of different generations. And if people of different ages speak differently, it's possible that either today's young people get old, they'll adopt old people's ways. And these changes across lifetime could be due to entering or leaving the workforce. For example, the love of young people of novelty or rebellion could be affecting this change. And for example, people born in 1930 may reflect 1930s way of talking. People born in 1990 may reflect the 1990s way of talking. That assumes that we speak the same way throughout our lives. Comparing generations lets us see change as it happens, and it overturns earlier linguist assumptions that we could only study change after the fact. So when people proposed it's possible to assess change and the direction of change at a particular time period rather than looking back at centuries. Some people actually were excited about that. So, studying the mechanisms of change lets us understand principles underlying language change more generally, and it assumes that it's possible to use the present to explain the past. And it assumes that the forces don't really change. It's the social details that change. Well, it's important to remember that languages don't change on their own. It is the speakers who change them. And there are some people who are more likely to lead change, such as brokers, right? In social networks, there are brokers of change, people who belong to many loose social networks, and people from high prestige groups. This is rare, but it's possible for a person from high prestige group to influence change by saying something that becomes fashionable and people start imitating that form. So we are trying to figure out social conditions. Sometimes there's stable social linguistic conditions, and if they are, it has been observed that men use a higher frequency of non-standard forms than women. For example, G-dropping is more frequent in male discourse than in female discourse. So with change from above, when there is a prestigious form that is being accepted by people of lower class, women favor the incoming prestige forms more than men do. Principle 2 is with change from below, women are more often innovators than men. Well, the summary of these principles is that women lead all change. Well, why do people change the way they speak? Sometimes it is caused by increased awareness of prestige forms, for example, through education or through media exposure, and then it affects attitudes, which might eventually affect language use. Possibly it's also caused by increased contact with speakers of other varieties through migration, possibly increased or improved infrastructure, desegregation, possibly tourism. It also can be caused by social aspirations when a variety increase in prestige and people try to adopt prestigious forms. Sometimes stigmatized forms gain popularity through resistance trends. For example, resistance to globalization or gentrification. Speakers can increase rates of locally identified speech to prove that they belong to this particular group or this particular location. So how do we test this? We often test that with apparent time findings from real-time studies by looking at speech from two different time periods. Either find some older data or go back to the community several years later and recheck. For example, if people were 20 in 1960 and they're the same generation who were 16, 20 in the year 2000, well, they'll have the same rate of use in the two time period. Then we will see that people kept that form throughout their lives. On the other hand, people who were 20 in 1960 are the same generation who were 16 to 2000, but they reduced their rates of using of a particular form when they got older. Then we can say that the difference we saw in 1960 was a difference that repeats itself every generation. It's called age grading. So there are two types of real-time studies. A panel study that looks at the same people just across time, and trend study that looks at different people with the same characteristics. So the researchers come back to the same community at different times and interview people of the same ages, but those are not the same people that were interviewed the previous times. An example is Montreal French study, and this one was a panel study. It interviewed the same people in 1971, 1984, and 1995. The challenge is that people moved and it was more difficult to find them. So every time there were fewer people in this study observed compared to 1971. They found that people changed their lexical features over time more than they changed their pronunciation. A different one is a trend study. It had access to recordings from different time periods, and each time period, researchers studied younger announcers compared to older announcers and came to the conclusion that older announcers increased their new features over time, but slower than the young people.